I have watched Tammy Baldwin, and I guess when you get to be my age, you can say you're proud of that performance. But I am truly not only proud, but proud to be represented by someone with guts, courage, and brains, and somebody who will take a chance on behalf of the people of this country. And so please welcome Tammy Baldwin, a congressman from the 2nd Congressional District.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, fellow progressives. Good morning. It's great to be back here for the 8th annual Fighting Bob Fest. As the debate rages in Washington, D.C. and across the country on health care reform, this is the antidote to all that ails us. A good, strong dose of progressive politics in the Baraboo Hills. Last November, the American people spoke, and their message was a clear and convincing call for change. After 8 long, destructive years of the Bush-Cheney regime, America voted for progressive reform. Reform to restore fiscal responsibility. Reform to rein in the excesses of the financial industry. Reform to develop a 21st century green economy. Reform to reduce our reliance on foreign and polluting sources of fuel. Reform to conserve our precious natural resources and confront climate change. Reform to prepare our school children to compete in a global economy. Reform to reaffirm our system of checks and balances. Reform to restore our leadership in the world community. Reform to bring our troops home from Iraq, and reform to bring our troops home from Afghanistan. Reform to ensure equal rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Americans. Reform to restore the right to organize. Reform to protect our food supply. Reform to protect and promote independent scientific inquiry. And reform to lower health care costs, improve medical outcomes, and finally, reform to ensure affordable, quality health care for all in America. This is what we worked for, this is what we organized for, and this is what we voted for. This is the will of the American people. And in the words of Fighting Bob La Follette, the will of the people shall be the law of the land. Now, this is what I and my fellow progressives in Congress and President Obama are working hard to achieve. And yet, as we toil to advance this agenda, the forces that oppose this agenda and this president, the special interests, the keepers of the status quo, the cynics, and throw in a few outright fools, they're pulling out every trick in their dirty little trick bag to bring our president and this progressive agenda down. You've heard them all summer long. You've seen them hijacking town hall meetings and grandstanding for the cameras, from high school gymnasiums to the halls of Congress. When they're not waving phony birth certificates, they're screaming about pulling the plug on grandma or calling the president a liar. And oh yes, they shout with ignorant indignation, "Keep the government's hands off my Medicare." Along with all that foolishness, they spread falsehoods and fear. The naysayers and the cynics will say and do anything to deflect attention from 47 million Americans who have no health insurance, from families who've gone bankrupt because of catastrophic health care expenses, from the children who are denied preventative care, from the seniors who can't afford to take their medicines, from the doctors who are buried in paperwork, frustrated by fee codes, and powerless to give their patients the time and attention that they deserve. But no more. As the president said on Wednesday, the time for bickering is over. The time for games is past. Now is the time to deliver on health care. Now, if all you'd read is the bloggers on the internet, or listened to the talking heads on cable TV, or only what you saw was the angry mobs at pre-planned and prepaid for town hall meetings, you could think that all was already lost, that the naysayers and the cynics and the keepers of the status quo had already prevailed. But you'd be wrong. Remember that 70% of the American people support a public, not-for-profit health plan option. Remember that the Speaker of the House has promised us a floor vote on an amendment that I sponsored, including a single-payer health care plan. We'll get a House vote on that. Oh yes, and when you think that they just might have the upper hand, remember that when the Blue Dog Democrats weakened the health insurance premium help for the very poor, I brokered a deal to restore those cuts. And remember that here in Wisconsin, with a program called Senior Care, we in Wisconsin have already proven that a public plan option can succeed. Democracy is a life, Fighting Bob wrote. It involves continual struggle. My fellow progressives, health care for all is what we demand in our democracy. This is our life, this is our struggle, and this is our call to action. Now we engage in this struggle not just for ourselves, but for our children and our children's children, and for future generations who rely on us, just as we relied on others, to leave the world better than we found it. With President Barack Obama in the White House, and Nancy Pelosi in the Speaker's chair, Russ Feingold in the Senate, and me in the House, and all of you in your communities, the progressive movement is alive and well in our state and in our nation. But none of us can achieve our goals alone. We are in it together. We cannot let the status quo hold us down. We should not let the voices of fear drown us out. And we must not let this year of hope dissolve into a winter of discontent. We must together prod my colleagues in Congress and President Obama not to bow to so-called moderate Republicans or to conservative Blue Dog Democrats or Democratic senators who've been handsomely supported by the healthcare industry. The will of the people shall be the law of the land. We must tell them not to water this down to the point of meaninglessness, all in the name of bipartisan The will of the people shall be the law of the land. We must tell them that we demand a public option. The will of the people shall be the law of the land. We must tell them to listen to that majority in the U.S. Senate that supports bold reform. And the will of the people shall be the law of the land. Tell them to listen to the majority of Americans who support health care for all, and the will of the people shall be the law of the land. We must tell them to remember the words of Paul Wellstone, of Ted Kennedy, of our own Dr. Linda Farley, and others who lived and died supporting single-payer health care. And the will of the people shall be the law of the land. Tell them to listen to the cries of 47 million Americans who have no health insurance, and the will of the people shall be the law of the land. Tell them to listen to the cries of the millions of Americans who've lost homes, life savings, and hope because of a medical catastrophe, and the will of the people shall be the law of the land. Tell them to listen to our cry from the Baraboo Hills to Bangor, Maine, to Bellingham, Washington, that the will of the people shall be the law of the land. If they were here today, we've no doubt that Bob and Belcase La Follette would be leading the charge for health care for all. But it's now our turn. This is now our time. We take up the banner. We demand health care for all, and we will continue until the will of the people becomes the law of the land. Thank you.
How about that? Tammy Baldwin. National ticket. It's about time. And she's been to every Bob Fest that we've had, so thank you, Tammy, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming back, and we'll see you next year.